In this lesson, we're going to continue talking about how to factor trinomials. And like in our last lesson, we talked about this equation up here at the top, ax squared plus bx plus c. And before we factored trinomials that had where a was equal to 1. Well, now we're going to focus on factoring trinomials where a is greater than 1. So a is now a coefficient that is something like 2 or 3 or 4 or so forth. So there is a little bit of a different technique on how to factor these trinomials. So let's go ahead and try a couple. So I always like to refer back to that first factoring technique that we've done, and it was factoring out the GCF, or the greatest common factor. I like to stick with that and do that whenever I can. So if I look at this first problem here, I want to ask myself, can I pull out a GCF? And you can see that there is no GCF to pull out. So, okay. So at least I've checked that method. Now I'm going to go ahead and factor this using this method. So I'm going to start off very similar to the last technique with the factoring trinomials of a coefficient equaling 1, but it's going to be just slightly different. Okay. Instead of trying to find factors of that last number in the problem, and then finding the sum of the center problem, what we're going to do is we're going to multiply the first number and the third number. So 4 times 3 is going to give us a 12. So we're going to look for factors of 12. And then the middle number will continue to be that number that we're looking for the sum. So let's go ahead and think about two numbers that multiply to give us 12, and then two numbers that add up to give us 7. And you're probably thinking of 4 and 3. So 4 times 3 gives us 12, and then 4 plus 3 gives us 7. So, okay, so let's go ahead and take those two numbers and break this down. This is where it's a little different. Originally, before, we could just go straight to the binomials, but it doesn't work that way with this. Now I have to break this down. Here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to take the first term, and I'm going to rewrite it as 4r squared. Now, this center term, I need to break up into two pieces. I'm going to use those two numbers that I've created, and I'm going to say plus 4r plus 3r. So I've broken up 7r, and I've made it 4r and 3r. And then I'm going to take that last term, 3, and I'm just going to bring him down. So it's going to create for you 4 terms. Now what I want to do is I want to break up each side of this polynomial. So I'm going to break it up into the first two terms, and then I'm going to break it up into the second two terms. And watch what I'm going to do. I'm going to take those two terms that are coming first, and I'm going to factor out the GCF. So if I factor out a GCF, I'm going to get 4r left over with r plus 1. Okay, now I'm going to look at the second portion, and I'm going to factor out my GCF of that portion. So I'm going to factor out a positive 3, and I'm going to be left with r plus 1. Now, you're going to notice here that the two factors in parentheses that you end up with, that is one of your factors. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to rewrite it as r plus 1. Because those two, they should always match up. Now, the other factors are going to be the numbers that are left over. So I have 4r plus 3. So I'm going to write 4r plus 3. And those are your two factors of your trinomial. Now you can always check yourself, and the way to check yourself is to FOIL this. If you were to FOIL this, you're going to get exactly what you started with in the beginning. And if not, something went wrong. Okay, let's try another one of these. All right, so for this one, let's go ahead and multiply our first two terms. So 6 times 15, that's going to give me 90. And then the sum is going to be that middle term that I have, negative 19. And always use the operations. All right, let's go ahead and think about what two numbers multiply to give you 90 and add to give you negative 19. I get negative 10 and negative 9. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use those numbers to break down my trinomial. So I'm going to start by rewriting my first term. My 6x squared, I'm just going to rewrite it. Now I'm going to go ahead and break up negative 19x, and I'm going to break it up using those two terms, the negative 10 and negative 9. Now, this is where I need to do a little bit of thinking. What is the order in which I'm going to write the negative 10 and the negative 9? You have to be thinking ahead, thinking, I'm going to factor something out of these two terms. So which terms go together better than the others? So for this one, I'm going to put negative 9x, because I know that I can pull out a 3 from those two numbers. And then I'm going to say negative 10x. And then I'm going to add my 15 on to the end. So for this one, I'm going to break it up again. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor out the GCF. So in my first two terms, I have a GCF of 3x. And then I'm going to be left over with 2x minus 3. Okay, now you have to kind of think ahead here. We are trying to create 2x minus 3 in the other parenthesis. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull out a negative 5. I'm going to be left with 2x minus 3. I can always redistribute it to double check myself to make sure that I factored it properly. And now you have your factors. We have our double factors. That's 2x minus 3. And then what's left over is the 3x minus 5. And at this point, we have our factors. So this is how you factor a trinomial with a coefficient greater than 1. Now I'm going to get a little bit deeper with these two concepts, and I'm going to show you just a little technique that you can use whenever you do happen to have a GCF. So I like to ask myself at the beginning, again, do I have a GCF? On the last two problems we did not, but these two problems we do. So I'm going to show you how you can factor out the GCF at the beginning or at the end, and then you can choose whichever you'd like to do, as long as you factor it completely. Okay, so let's factor out the GCF first. So if I look at this, I have an 8, I have an 8, and I have a 6. So of course, my GCF is going to be a 2. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out, and I'm going to be left with 4m squared plus 4m minus 3. Okay, now that I have that, I have the GCF, and I can't forget about him out front, but I'm going to focus on the trinomial that is within the parentheses. And I'm going to go ahead and multiply my 4 times my negative 3. That's going to give me negative 12. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to find my middle number, which is positive 4. So I need two numbers that are going to multiply to give me negative 12, but that are going to also sum to give me 4. So I'm thinking about 6 times negative 2, and then 6 plus negative 2 will give me that 4. So those are my two numbers that I'm going to use. So here's where we're going to go. I'm going to carry down my GCF, and now I'm going to break him down here. I'm going to break this down into 4m squared, and this middle term is going to be broken down into, I need to figure out where my 6 and my 2 are going to go. So I'm going to go ahead and place my 2, my negative 2m, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place my 6m. And then I'm going to carry down my negative 3. Okay? From here, you need to keep yourself very organized. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to group those two first terms and my two last terms. And I'm going to go ahead and factor things out. The parentheses are going to be starting to generate at this point, so feel free to use brackets. So my GCF is 2. I'm going to use a bracket. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to factor out a 2m parentheses 2m minus 1. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead over here, and I need to be able to think about this. I want to create 2m minus 1 inside. So that means I need to pull out a positive 3. Okay? At this point, we're almost finished. So I'm going to go ahead and put my factors together. One of my factors is my GCF of 2. My other factor is going to be my repeated factors, which is 2m minus 1. And then my last factor that I'm working with is what's left over, that 2m plus 3. And I have 3 separate factors that are all 3 my answers for this problem. Now, for this problem, I factored out the GCF at the very beginning. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to factor it out at the end. So you can really do whatever you want with this. You can do it at the beginning or the end. It doesn't really matter. But let's go ahead and try this one. Let's go ahead and factor it out last this time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by multiplying my 12 and my positive 6. That's going to give me 72. And then my sum is that negative 27. So I need to figure out my 2 numbers that multiply to give me 72 and that add to give me negative 27. I found them to be negative 24 times negative 3, and then negative 24 plus negative 3. Okay, so those are my factors. Let's go ahead and work this out now. So now I have 12x squared, and now I'm going to go ahead and break down my negative 27x into my negative 24 and negative 3. So I'm going to say negative 24x minus 3x plus 6. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and continue, and I'm going to go ahead and group the first 2, and I'm going to group the second 2. I'm going to go ahead and pull out 12x, and I'll be left with x minus 2. And over here, I want to be left with x minus 2. So I need to go ahead and pull out negative 3. Okay. So now here are my factors. I have my first factor is going to be x minus 2. And those are the ones that repeat. And then the next one's going to be 12x minus 3. Okay, at this point, you might recognize... I'm sorry, I'm missing an x here, 12x. There we go. You notice that this factor over here, 12x minus 3, it's not fully factored, right? Because I could pull out a GCF of that one. So this is where, at the very end of the problem, you have to pull out that GCF. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite that first one. I'm going to write it as, I'm going to pull out the 3, and I'm going to be left with 4x minus 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and write that second one, x minus 2. So at this point, all 3 terms are fully factored, and you are done. If you left it like this right here, that is unsimplified and would not be counted as correct. All right, so we talked about factoring. Yep, that's it for today, factoring trinomials with a coefficient greater than 1.